Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're doing things a little differently. We're time traveling.
Time traveling.
Yeah, back to ancient Israel.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant, like, actually time traveling.
No, not that kind of time travel.
All right. So ancient Israel.
But not for a boring history lecture or anything. We're going deep into the Book of Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy. Interesting choice.
Yep, that Deuteronomy, the one that everyone kind of remembers from Sunday school.
Ah, got it. So what's so special about Deuteronomy?
Well, I've been skimming through it, and honestly, it's way more interesting than I remember. It's packed with all these surprising insights. You wouldn't believe what they had to say about justice and warfare and family life.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm intrigued.
And even bathroom habits. Get ready for some serious aha moments.
All right, you've got my attention. So Deuteronomy, not just a dusty old law book, huh?
Definitely not. It's like a window into how an entire nation was trying to figure out how to live. Like what it meant to have a relationship with their God and how that played out in their everyday lives.
That makes sense. And for the Israelites, that relationship was pretty much central to everything, wasn't it?
Oh, totally. It's like their whole world revolved around their covenant with God.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how those beliefs shaped not just their religious practices, but their laws, their social structures, even things like how they farmed their land. It's a completely different way of looking at the world than what we're used to.
Right, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not just learning about ancient laws, we're getting a glimpse into a completely different mindset.
I'm ready to have my mind blown. Where do we start?
Well, one of the first things that jumped out at me was this word tzedek. It pops up constantly in Deuteronomy, and it often gets translated as justice.
C-deck. I've heard that before.
But it feels like there's more to it than just, the legal definition of justice. It seems to have a deeper, richer meaning, don't you think?
You're absolutely right. C-deck goes beyond just following the letter of the law. It's like, imagine justice, but with a soul.
I like that. Justice with a soul.
That's C-deck. It's about fairness, but it's a fairness that's rooted in God's character. It's not enough to just have laws. The goal is to create a society where that kind of fairness, that deep sense of rightness, is actually lived out, especially for those who are most vulnerable.
So it's like a higher standard of justice, one that goes beyond what humans might come up with on our own.
Exactly. And we see that playing out in some pretty interesting ways. Like, Deuteronomy is really big on protecting the jir. That's the Hebrew word for resident alien or foreigner.
Oh, wow. So they actually had laws protecting foreigners.
They did, which is pretty surprising when you consider that in a lot of ancient societies, foreigners were treated with suspicion, even hostility. But in Deuteronomy, they're entitled to the same justice and fairness as anyone else.
Wow, that is surprising. It feels kind of progressive for an ancient text, especially when you consider how many societies back then were, pretty xenophobic. What do you think motivated this concern for fairness toward foreigners?
Well, the Israelites believed that God cared about all people, not just them. So a society that claims to follow God has to reflect that expansive care.
It's like they were saying, hey, our God cares about everyone, so we better treat everyone right.
Exactly. It was this radical notion that justice shouldn't stop at your borders. It had to extend to everyone who lived within their society.
I mean, that's still a challenge for us today.
Oh, absolutely. But it's inspiring to see that the Israelites were grappling with these issues, even back then.
It makes you think about what we could accomplish if we took those ideas seriously today.
No kidding.
And it's not just about foreigners, is it? We see this concern for getting justice right in other laws, too. Like, there are all these rules about needing multiple witnesses in a trial.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one in Deuteronomy.
It's almost like, an early version of due process, centuries before those ideas really took root elsewhere. What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, they were very clear that you couldn't just convict someone based on the word of a single person. You needed multiple witnesses to make sure judgments were based on solid evidence, not just hearsay or personal grudges.
So they really took fairness in their legal system seriously?
Oh, absolutely. It was a central part of their understanding of justice. And honestly, it's something we could still learn from today, right? How many times do we rush to judgment based on incomplete information?
All the time, especially on social media. It's like everyone's a judge, jury, and executioner.
Right. But Deuteronomy reminds us that true justice requires careful consideration, reliable evidence, and a commitment to fairness for everyone involved.
Deep stuff. I never thought I'd be getting a lesson in legal ethics from an ancient text.
See, Deuteronomy is full of surprises.
Speaking of surprises, let's talk about war. I mean, we all know the Bible has its share of battles, but there's something different about how Deuteronomy lays out these very specific rules of engagement. It's not just about military strategy, is it?
Not at all. For the Israelites, warfare was, well, it was deeply spiritual. It was a holy mission.
A holy mission.
Yeah, they saw God as the ultimate commander of their armies.
Wow. Imagine going into battle with that conviction. The stakes must have felt incredibly high.
Absolutely. Every battle was a test of faith, a way to prove their loyalty to Yahweh.
So if they believed they were fighting on God's behalf, did that affect how they were supposed to treat their enemies?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where things get pretty interesting, because Deuteronomy makes some fascinating distinctions between different types of enemies. For cities that were far off, like way outside their territory, they were actually supposed to offer peace first.
Really? So it wasn't all about just conquering everyone in sight.
No, not at all. For those distant cities, the goal was more about bringing them under Israelite rule, as vassals. It was like saying, hey, join our team and you'll basically be on the winning side with God on our side, of course.
So it's kind of like a join or die situation, but with a religious twist. But things get a lot more complicated when it comes to the Canaanite nations, right? Like Deuteronomy doesn't exactly advocate for peace talks there.
It definitely doesn't. In fact, it commands something that's pretty difficult for modern readers to process.
What do you mean?
Well, it calls for the complete annihilation of those groups.
Like no survivors?
No treaties, no mercy. It was what they called Kerem warfare, a holy war, where the goal was the total destruction of those nations.
Whoa. Okay, that's definitely one of those parts of Deuteronomy that can be really tough to wrap your head around today. I mean, how do we even begin to understand such a drastic command?
It's important to remember that the Israelites saw the Canaanite nations as more than just military adversaries. They represented a spiritual threat.
A spiritual threat. How so?
Well, they practiced idolatry and, all sorts of things that were considered abhorrent to Yahweh. And the Israelites believed that those practices were a kind of spiritual contamination, something that could corrupt their covenant with God like a cancer.
So from their perspective, it wasn't just about conquering land. It was about protecting their very identity as God's chosen people.
Exactly. And to do that, they believed they had to eradicate anything that threatened that identity, even if it meant taking what we would consider extreme measures.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, but this idea of maintaining social order, preventing chaos within the Israelite community, that seems to be a big theme in Deuteronomy. And speaking of social order, Deuteronomy also gets pretty deep into the complexities of family life, doesn't it? Like way deeper than just the whole honor your father and mother thing.
Oh, yeah, it definitely goes there. And it can get pretty intense.
Like that law about the rebellious son, I read that and was like, wait, what? What were the specific conditions that would lead to such a drastic punishment?
Okay, so it's important to remember that this wasn't about, punishing a kid for talking back to their parents or sneaking out past curfew.
So what was it about?
This law applied to a son who was repeatedly disobedient to his parents, like constantly. And not just disobedient, Deuteronomy describes him as a glutton and a drunkard.
Wow. Okay, so this was serious stuff.
It was meant as a last resort for someone whose behavior was just like completely out of control. Someone who refused to listen to any authority and was deemed a threat to the stability of the family.
And I guess by extension, a threat to the community as a whole.
Exactly. Because in ancient Israel, the family unit was the foundation of society. A rebellious son who rejected his parents' authority was basically undermining that very foundation.
Makes sense. It's like they're saying, look, if you can't even respect your own parents, how can we trust you to be a responsible member of society?
Right. It was about protecting the social fabric, the core values that held their community together.
Deuteronomy also has all these surprisingly detailed instructions about inheritance rights, especially for sons from different wives. Polygamy was pretty common back then, so I get why they'd need rules around that. But it's still fascinating how much detail they go into. What was driving that?
Well, I think it was about ensuring fairness. Making sure that all sons, regardless of which wife they were born to, received their rightful share of the inheritance. The firstborn son, no matter who his mother was always entitled to a double portion.
A double portion? Why was that?
It was like a built-in system to prevent favoritism and jealousy between the sons, and hopefully, to keep things harmonious within the family, even when things got complicated.
Smart. It's like they were trying to create a legal system that would head off family drama before it even started.
Right. Minimize the potential for conflict and keep things running smoothly.
Which, let's face it, is a goal that's still relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. Who doesn't want a little less family drama?
Okay, so we've talked about justice, warfare, family drama. Now for the fun part.
Oh, what's the fun part?
Well, we've got to talk about those unconventional poverty laws. You know what I'm talking about.
Right, yes. The U factor of Deuteronomy.
Exactly. I mean, they get incredibly detailed about cleanliness and ritual purity. Like they cover everything from hygiene in military camps.
Makes sense. You don't want disease spreading through your army.
Right, but then they go on to, lay down the law about who is allowed to participate in religious gatherings. And then there's all that very specific stuff about, well, bathroom etiquette.
Oh, yeah. The bathroom stuff.
I get why they wanted to keep things sanitary, but the requirement to bury excrement outside the camp, I mean, come on. Suddenly I'm feeling very grateful for modern plumbing.
Me too. Although composting toilets are becoming a thing again, so maybe Deuteronomy was ahead of its time.
Maybe, but then there's that whole ban on people with certain genital conditions from entering the assembly. That one's a head scratcher for me. What was going on there?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because those laws weren't just about physical cleanliness. They were about this deeper idea of holiness, like separating the sacred from the profane.
So you're saying even going to the bathroom was a spiritual act?
In a sense, yeah, it was all part of maintaining that right relationship with Yahweh, of showing devotion through their actions and even their physical state.
It's a whole different way of looking at the world, isn't it? What seems totally bizarre to us was perfectly normal for the ancient Israelites. It makes you wonder what future generations will find weird about our lives.
Right. Like imagine someone in the future digging up one of our bathroom manuals. They'd probably think we were crazy.
Or maybe they'll be jealous of all our fancy plumbing. But before we get too lost in the future, let's stick with Deuteronomy for a bit longer. We've covered a lot: justice, warfare, family dynamics, even bathroom habits. But there's still so much more to explore.
It's a wild ride, that's for sure. And it's amazing how deep this connection between religion and law runs in Deuteronomy. It's hard to overstate that, wouldn't you say?
Totally. I mean, for the ancient Israelites, it's like every aspect of their lives was seen through this lens of, their covenant with God. Everything from planting crops to going to war.
Exactly. Even the stuff we'd consider pretty mundane today, like how they ran their businesses or raised their kids, it was all connected to their relationship with Yahweh.
It's like they never really saw a separation between like secular and sacred. It was all just life, lived in accordance with God's will.
Right. And, that brings us back to this whole idea of holy war that we touched on earlier. For the Israelites, this wasn't about, territorial expansion or conquest in the way we typically think about it today.
So what was it about?
It was about fulfilling God's will, acting as his instruments to bring judgment upon those they perceived as wicked.
And that plays out pretty dramatically in those instructions for dealing with conquered cities, right? We talked about how how they had the option of offering peace to cities that were, far off, essentially absorbing them as vassals.
Right, like bringing them into the fold, so to speak.
But for the Canaanite nations, it was a completely different story.
A much harsher story, yeah. Deuteronomy commands the complete annihilation of these groups: men, women, children, even their livestock. It's a concept that's just incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for us to grab to today.
Yeah, to say the least. It's like, how can we even begin to reconcile that kind of command with the idea of a loving and merciful God? I mean, what was the theological justification they used for such extreme measures?
Well, it's important to remember that the Israelites saw these Canaanite nations as steeped in idolatry and all sorts of practices that were just abhorrent to Yahweh.
Right. We talked about that a bit earlier. They saw those practices as like a spiritual contamination, right?
Exactly. A dangerous influence that needed to be completely eradicated to prevent it from spreading and corrupting their covenant with God, like a dangerous disease.
So it was about more than just like, conquering territory or defeating enemies. It was about preserving their unique identity, their way of life, their relationship with God, even if it meant resorting to, what we would consider just unimaginable brutality.
Exactly. It really highlights that stark contrast between the ancient Israelite worldview and our own modern sensibilities. The concept of a holy war where God commands the slaughter of entire populations is just simply incompatible with most contemporary ethical frameworks.
No kidding. It's a good reminder that while there are definitely timeless themes in Deuteronomy, like justice, faith, obedience, there are also aspects that are just very much products of their time and culture. We can't just impose our own modern values on an ancient text and expect it to, make sense to us.
Absolutely. We have to try to understand it within its historical context. But even within those, culturally specific laws, we can often find glimpses of a deeper concern for fairness and order.
Like those laws about debt slavery, for example. I was reading about the practice known as Shemitah, where they were mandated to release debt slaves every 7 years. It seems so progressive for its time, this idea that even those who had fallen into economic hardship wouldn't be permanently trapped in servitude.
It really is remarkable. And it wasn't just about, letting them go empty-handed either. Deuteronomy instructs the Israelites to provide for these freed slaves generously, like from their flocks, their threshing floors, their wine presses,
So they were supposed to give them like a severance package.
basically. It's a powerful example of compassion embedded within their legal framework, a recognition that economic justice was part of living in right relationship with God.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is.
We also see that that same concern for fairness reflected in those laws about inheritance that we were talking about earlier, especially for sons from different wives.
Yes, polygamy was common in ancient Israel, remember? And those laws were specifically designed to prevent favoritism and ensure that all sons, no matter which wife they were born to, received their rightful share of the inheritance. The firstborn son, regardless of which wife he was born to, was entitled to a double portion. It's a system that's meant to minimize potential conflicts and maintain harmony within families, even those with complex structures.
It's amazing how Deuteronomy tackles these very specific situations that you might not expect to find in an ancient law code. Like, what happens if a man accuses his wife of adultery, but then it turns out she was actually, a virgin when they got married? Talk about awkward.
That's the slanderous husband law, and it's pretty fascinating. It really reveals this concern for protecting the reputation and rights of women, even within a patriarchal society. So if a husband made false accusations against his wife, he faced a hefty fine and was permanently barred from divorcing her.
Wow, talk about consequences.
Right. It's a pretty strong deterrent against making, false accusations, isn't it?
No kidding. I mean, I guess back then a woman's reputation was everything, so to falsely accuse her of adultery would be like totally ruining her life.
Exactly. And so the law stepped in to protect her. And, it's interesting because it shows that even within those patriarchal structures of ancient Israel, they attempted to create legal safeguards to prevent the abuse of power.
So it's not just a story of oppression, it's more nuanced than that.
Much more.
There were actually attempts to protect the vulnerable, to make sure that justice was served, even for women.
Exactly. It wasn't a perfect system by any means, but it's interesting to see those glimmers of concern for protecting those who might otherwise be, taken advantage of.
Okay, so we've talked about justice, warfare, family dynamics, and even a little bit of ancient marriage counseling. But we can't avoid those unconventional purity laws forever.
I think our listeners are probably bracing themselves for this part.
I know I am. All that detail about hygiene in military camps, who was allowed to participate in religious gatherings, and of course, those very specific bathroom instructions.
It's definitely a lot to process, especially for, modern sensibilities. I mean, requiring people to bury their excrement outside the camp, that's not exactly something we'd find in a health and safety manual today.
For real, I'm suddenly very grateful for indoor plumbing. But you've mentioned before that these laws weren't just about, physical hygiene. There was a deeper spiritual dimension to them, right?
Exactly. For the Israelites, maintaining a state of ritual purity was essential for approaching God in worship. They believed that holiness was about separating the sacred from the profane, and that extended to all aspects of their lives, even their bodily functions.
So even going to the bathroom was like a religious act.
You could say that. It was all about demonstrating their devotion to Yahweh through their actions and their physical state, about maintaining that right relationship with the divine.
It's like a whole different way of looking at the world, isn't it? What seems totally normal to them would be considered bizarre to us, and vice versa. It makes you wonder what seemingly ordinary aspects of our lives today might seem strange or shocking to future generations.
That's a great question to ponder. What will people 1,000 years from now think when they dig up our, TikTok videos and Instagram posts?
Ooh, yeah, good point. They'll probably think we were all completely obsessed with ourselves. But before we get too lost in the future, let's bring our focus back to Deuteronomy. We've covered a lot of ground justice, warfare, family dynamics, purity laws. But there's one more crucial aspect we need to explore, the concept of blessings and curses.
Ah, yes, the classic choose life or choose death scenario.
Exactly. Deuteronomy is pretty clear about the consequences of, obedience and disobedience.
It is. And for the Israelites, this wasn't just some abstract theological concept. They truly believed that their actions had had tangible, real-world consequences.
So they believed that if they followed God's laws, good things would happen, and if they disobeyed, bad things would happen.
Exactly. Like if they followed God's laws, they would be blessed with abundance, victory, prosperity. But if they turned away from Yahweh and embraced idolatry, they would face famine, disease, defeat, and ultimately exile.
Talk about motivation, knowing that your choices had such profound consequences, both for yourself and your community. That must have been a pretty powerful incentive to stay on the right path.
Absolutely. It really emphasizes the importance of that covenant relationship between God and Israel. Obedience wasn't just about, following an arbitrary set of rules. It was about maintaining that covenant, about living in harmony with the divine will and experiencing the tangible benefits of that alignment.
I'm also struck by how central the land is in all of this. Like so many of the blessings and curses are tied to the land. Abundance of crops, victory over enemies, even just the ability to remain in the land versus being, driven out. What do you make of that?
That's a great observation. For the Israelites, the land wasn't just, a piece of property. It was a gift from God, a tangible symbol of his covenant with them. To be driven out of the land was like the ultimate punishment, a sign that they had broken the covenant and forfeited God's favor.
It's really a different way of thinking about things, isn't it? Today we tend to be more, individualistic. We focus on personal success or misfortune. But for the ancient Israelites, it was all about the collective, the community. Their fate was intertwined, for better or worse.
You're absolutely right. And that sense of collective responsibility, it permeates all of Deuteronomy. It's not just about, individual piety. It's about building a just and righteous society that reflects the character of Yahweh, a society where everyone benefits from the collective obedience to the covenant.
It's a challenging concept, but also kind of inspiring in a way, It reminds us that our choices, both individually and collectively, really do have consequences, and that we have a responsibility to create a world that aligns with our values and beliefs, a world where everyone can flourish.
Well said. And speaking of challenging concepts, there's one more aspect of Deuteronomy we need to address before we wrap up this deep dive, the issue of divine judgment.
Ooh, this should be good. Bring on the fire and brimstone.
Not quite fire and brimstone, but definitely some tough love from Yahweh. Deuteronomy is very clear that God is both just and merciful, but he's also willing to punish disobedience. And sometimes that punishment is pretty severe.
We see that in those laws about idolatry, right? Like any Israelite who turned away from Yahweh and embraced other gods, they faced the death penalty. Talk about taking your faith seriously.
It really underscores how seriously they took their covenant with God. Idolatry was seen as the ultimate betrayal, a breaking of that sacred bond. And the punishment was meant to both purge the sin from the community and serve as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to stray from the path.
It's fascinating how that idea of corporate responsibility, comes into play here too. Like even if only a few individuals engaged in idolatry, the entire community could suffer the consequences. It's like they believe that sin had this ripple effect, that the actions of a few could taint the whole nation and bring down God's wrath upon them all.
Exactly. The idea was that they were all in this together, bound by their covenant with God. Their fate was intertwined, for better or worse. So the actions of one person could have, far-reaching consequences for everyone.
It makes you think about, the impact our choices have, not just on our own lives, but on the lives of those around us. It's a sobering thought, but also a reminder that we're all connected in ways we may not always realize.
You're right. And it emphasizes that interconnectedness of the Israelite community, that sense that they were all in this together, bound by their covenant with God. Their fate was intertwined, for better or for worse.
Speaking of fate, Deuteronomy ends with a pretty dramatic prophecy, doesn't it?
It does. Moses, knowing that his time is drawing near, delivers this powerful and poetic song that foretells both the blessings that await Israel if they remain faithful to God, and the the curses that will befall them if they stray from the covenant path.
It's such a poignant moment. Moses, this great leader who has guided them through the wilderness for 40 years, giving them one final warning, a glimpse into a future that holds both promise and peril.
And it's a reminder that the story of Israel, like all human stories, is a tapestry woven from both light and shadow, from moments of triumph and times of tragedy.
But even in the midst of hardship, there's always that possibility of redemption, of returning to that right relationship with God.
Exactly, and that's a message that echoes throughout Deuteronomy and beyond. It's a message of hope, a reminder that even when we stumble and fall, there's always a path back to the divine embrace.
It's a message that still resonates with us today, don't you think? It encourages us to think about our own choices, our own relationship with the divine, and the kind of world we're creating for ourselves and for future generations.
It really is. It makes you step back and think about the bigger picture.
Totally. But before we get like too philosophical, let's bring things back down to earth for a minute. Literally.
Okay, back to earth.
One of the things that I found super fascinating about Deuteronomy was like how detailed it gets about stuff like agriculture.
Agriculture, farming.
Yeah, it's like they wanted to write down everything they knew about how to work the land.
Well, it was their livelihood, right? Their survival depended on it.
True, but it's more than just like practical advice. It feels like there's this deeper layer to it, like a spiritual connection to the land.
Oh, absolutely. For the Israelites, working the land wasn't just a job. It was an act of worship.
Worship, really?
Yeah. It was a way to honor God's gift of creation. Like they saw themselves as partners with God in sustaining life.
I love that. It's like they saw farming as this like sacred duty.
Exactly. And they even incorporated those beliefs into their agricultural practices. Like they were commanded to leave the edges of their fields unharvested
Why was that?
so that the poor and the stranger could glean what remained.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
It was this really powerful expression of compassion, woven right into the fabric of their daily lives.
It's like they recognized that everyone, no matter their social status, had the right to like share in the abundance of the land. It wasn't just about, every man for himself. It was about taking care of each other.
Exactly. And we see that same concern for fairness reflected in their economic practices too. Like Deuteronomy has these pretty strict rules about lending and borrowing money.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, for example, it forbids charging interest on loans to fellow Israelites.
No interest. But wasn't that like super common back then?
It was in other ancient societies, yeah. But the Israelites believed that lending should be an act of charity, not a way to exploit those who are in need.
It's like they were saying, look, we're all in this together. We should be helping each other out, not trying to profit from each other's misfortune.
Exactly. It was about putting community above personal gain.
That's so radical, especially when you consider how like obsessed we are with money and profit today.
It is. It makes you wonder what would happen if we tried to create an economic system that was actually based on, compassion and mutual support instead of just relentless competition.
Right. What would that even look like?
I don't know. But it's a good question to think about.
Definitely. So, when we first started this deep dive into Deuteronomy, I have to admit, I was a little, I don't know, intimidated. Like, it has a bit of a reputation for being, strict, maybe even a little scary at times.
Yeah, I get that. It can definitely be intense.
But as we've been talking, what's really struck me is how much of it is actually about creating a just and compassionate society. A society where everyone is treated fairly and has the opportunity to thrive.
I think that's a really insightful observation. Deuteronomy can definitely be challenging at times, and there are certainly parts of it that just don't resonate with modern sensibilities. But at its core, it's really a vision for how to live in right relationship with God, with each other, and with the world around us. It's about creating a society that reflects those values, a society that's built on justice, compassion, and a deep reverence for the divine.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Deuteronomy, what do you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I hope they come away with, a renewed appreciation for the richness and complexity of this ancient text. It's not just a collection of, dusty old laws. It's a window into the heart of a people who are wrestling with some really profound questions about how to live a meaningful and ethical life.
And maybe it's even sparked some questions for them to ponder in their own lives. Like what What values are we upholding in our societies today? Are we living in a way that reflects those values, and what kind of legacy are we leaving for future generations?
Those are great questions. And I think Deuteronomy, as challenging and sometimes perplexing as it can be, can offer us some valuable insights as we grapple with those very questions in our own lives.
So there you have it, folks. Your deep dive into Deuteronomy, a journey through ancient laws, surprising insights, and timeless questions that continue to resonate with us today. We hope you've enjoyed the ride. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those aha moments. 2022.